Good afternoon. I'm Charles Lundquist. We're doing an interview for the archives at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. This is part of the oral history archives that we have, and we have a number of interviews like this one. Today is January 29th, 2016. We always like to get that in so that there's a record for when it was done. The guests today are Heide Lusser Kingsbury. She is a daughter of Robert Lusser, who will emphasize in this conversation for a while, and then his granddaughter, Suzanne Rico. So that we have a three-generation party here today. And I guess I'd like to start out by letting you talk a little bit about your father, if you would please, and the life in Germany and so forth.
Okay. I was born in 1932, which was an interesting time in Germany because Hitler had come into power. But my dad was an aeronautical engineer who got his degree in 1928, and then he started to work for an aircraft company, Clem, and he designed small sports planes. And with those little sports planes, he entered the international air circuits. And these races were fascinating in that they would go through France, Germany, Italy, or into the Scandinavian countries, and what takes us now half an hour would take days for them to fly. And he won 6 out of in 6 categories out of 11 races. And then from there he went to Heinkel, which is an aircraft company up north, and I don't know why he quit there, but then he went to Messerschmitt in Augsburg, and he became the chief of design. And in that capacity, he helped Messerschmitt design the Me-108, the Me-19, which was a fighter plane, the Me-110, and 262, and a whole bunch.
Lots of planes.
Lots of planes.
All right.
And then came the war, and eventually he worked for Heinkel again, and designed the first jet engine to fly, but it was not chosen to be the airplane that they used then. They used the Messerschmitt, and then thereafter he worked for Fiesler Aircraft, and he developed the V1. And that created a whole bunch of problems for the family because we lived through all the carpet bombing in Germany, and eventually we were burned out, and we ended up on a farmhouse after living in a Bauhaus house. We ended up in a one room in a farmhouse in the depths of Bavaria, and on the 13th of March 1945, it must have been American bombers. They came over the Alps. One of them left, circled over the farmhouse, and dropped its bomb and made a direct hit. And my mother was killed, which caused my father to be able to leave Berlin, which, as you know, was under orders to be defended under all circumstances. And so he was able to leave Berlin and come to us in Bavaria. And the good part about that is that he was not in the Russian zone, but rather in the American zone. And then the Americans came and offered him, not made him. Believe me, I was happy. I was very happy. And we got to come to the United States.
Okay, let's go back and pick up the theme on the V1. When did the work on that start, roughly?
For him, it started in 1944.
44.
And
so the war was well underway by then.
Well underway, but you know, the Germans were losing everywhere, and they were looking for weapons that would bring the final victory, and so he had talked to the guy who was pushing for a pulse jet engine to use that to make into a bomber in a guided missile with a warhead. And my dad took the thing, the sketch, and made a preliminary sketch, and that's exactly how the thing then was built. And of course,
where was this development done?
In Kassel, in the town named Kassel, and but then they moved the whole engineering bureau to Nordhausen, maybe 200 kilometers north of Kassel. He had maybe 50 engineers, and they worked on that there. But in the meantime, the family stayed in the city of Kassel, but there were constant air raids, and that's why he moved us all to that farmhouse. And we were burned down 3 times, so anyway, we ended up, it was pretty miserable. During the war, they had the food distribution pretty well controlled, but at the end of the war, it all fell apart, and so it was pretty miserable living. So for me as a teenager, when I heard we were going to America, I said, yes! and I came over, and I never looked back.
How many brothers and sisters did you
Well,
have?
we had a bunch. There were 5 of us in the first batch, and then my father told the Americans who came and asked him to come to America, yes, but I have a personal matter. I wish to get married again. And I heard that, and I said, oh my gosh, he's going to give us a stepmother. But she turned out to be absolutely wonderful, and over here they had 4 more. So he had 9 children, and 7 of us are still alive. And
spread out where?
There's 4 of them. Well, after he came to Huntsville, then he went back to Germany in 1958. In 1959, and became director of Messerschmitt again. But he took the 4 kids with him, and they're all in Germany, and they're all doctors. They're all medical doctors.
Really?
Yes.
That's remarkable.
Which is weird.
Yeah. That's remarkable.
And
all right.
none of his 9 kids learned how to fly. Not one of us.
Really?
No, but we all the rest of it that he liked to do, like skiing and sailing, and we got the genes, but not the.
I think it's interesting too, from a personal perspective, that the 5 children that he had and raised in Germany, who lived the bulk of their early lives up and through their teenager years in Germany, they all ended up as Americans, and all the kids that were born in America ended up as Germans.
That is a remarkable
Right? I think that's just an
incident.
interesting little footnote.
So anyway, the V1, was in Germany. Of course, it was a smash hit. We, as children, I was only 10 or 11 when it first was put into action. My mother swore us to secrecy, and but that was the times. Everything was in Germany was shh, don't say anything. And but then when we came to America, I was a teenager. I was 16. And so I was a full-on teenager. I never looked back, and I became a convinced teenager, and so we lived in Point Mugu, which is on the California coast, and he worked for the U.S. Navy.
What was the date when you got there, roughly?
We came here on November 4th. 1948, when the headline said, Dewey won. And it was really Truman. And that was our first taste of American elections, which was extremely interesting, which was a big oops. And so then my dad went to work at Point Mugu, which is a Navy installation, and he worked on the Loon. And the Loon was a replica of the V1, and the reason why they already had working models is because 60% of all the V1s fell in the ocean. Because they were so unreliable, because they were developed in such a hurry that they couldn't do any of the tests. And so he worked on that, and then from there he went to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, but by that time he had made a name for himself, and he was called the father of reliability, because he developed what is called now Lusser's law, which states that the reliability of complex systems are not of its individual components, but of the product of the individual components. And this is a law which is still to this day taught in engineering schools. And so anyway, he was this reliability expert, and with that then he came to Huntsville, to the Redstone.
Okay. How did he have to get recruited, or did he?
I guess so. That they knew that they had to be. Reliability was was a big thing, and so he just came here. And by that time I guess I was in college, and I went to the University of California as an English major, of all strange things. So
why not?
Well, it was that I was only here like 3 years, and so they asked me, what do you want to major in? I said, major? Does it have anything to do with the military? And they said, no, you got to declare a field of study. And I said, I don't want a field of study, I just want to be educated. And they said, well, that's not the way it works here. And so I chose to be an English major. I thought it would have philosophy, English, history, everything would be combined. And so I became an English major, which was kind of crazy, actually, because I didn't speak English that well. But I made it with very good grades. And anyway, and so they.
Which university was that?
University of California. I started out in Berkeley. But with 60,000 students.
Oh yeah.
It was too big for me, and I changed to Santa Barbara and graduated from there. And so.
Well, did you actually live in Huntsville at all, or?
No, but then when I met my husband in that junior college in Ventura, where we lived near Point Mugu, he was going to Fort Benning as a lieutenant, and I had asked him to marry me, and he said yes. and so my parents were living here, and so I asked my parents if they would put together a wedding, and we came, and Mrs. von Braun came to my wedding and gave me a tablecloth, and so we had a small wedding here, and that's my only exposure to Huntsville. And this is the first time that I've come back.
Was that the Lutheran church?
Yeah, yes, at a little itty bitty Lutheran church.
Yes, I know the church well.
Really, a kind of a wooden clapboard construction.
It's been enlarged considerably.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and that was my only exposure to. But as far as coming to the United States, I have to say that this was early on, in November '48, which was fairly soon after the war, and the people took us in like long lost relatives. I never felt any fear of that they wouldn't like us. I mean, you have to remember I was a teenager, but our neighborhood took us in, embraced us. Women came to help my mother, who had one kid after another, and I mean, it was so warm and welcoming that I never had any problems integrating at all. And to me, it was kind of amazing. You know, I thought there would be more resentment, but it wasn't. Everybody helped us. Everybody was eager to embrace us, which it kind of says something about the American spirit.
Yeah, well, the Americans were never angry with the German people. They didn't care much for the leadership.
Yeah, right. And anyway, and so then they were here. I had my own life, and as I said, I met my husband, who was in the army, and then we were stationed in Germany, and then I had some kids, and then he went to Vietnam, and he was killed there in 1967.
Oh, what a shame.
And I had these 3 kids, and I raised them, and I went to work, and I worked for Ronald Reagan as a writer.
Oh, wonderful.
I wrote, because, you know, my English major.
Yeah.
Came in handy.
My English major business came in handy, and the philosophy appealed to me. So, but in the meantime, you know, in a way, I was separated from my family, and they were here, and then had gone back to Germany.
Did you go to Washington then to work for Reagan?
Well, you know, the head of the personnel bureau was a very good friend of mine. She later on became ambassador to Austria from America, and she said the problem with women is they do not want to leave their husbands, they do not want to leave their families, they do not want to move their children, and we are having a terrible time getting women to come and work. And she tried to talk me into it, and I said, I can't. I've got teenagers. But so I worked 3 months. 3 months I did the meeting of the industrialized nations, and I did that for 3 months, and then went back home because I had these 3 kids, and you know, and I got them all through graduate school.
Wonderful.
And
In what fields?
Oh, one of them was a lawyer, one of them was a horticulturist, and the other one got her was a business major, and she's now working. She's the director of AT&T. So they're all launched.
Well, very good.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we ought to turn to you and how you fit into this family. We've heard one branch of it. I think you must be from another branch.
Well, I'm the granddaughter, so I'm once removed, and what I remember most about my grandfather was this picture that we had on the wall at our house. And in it, he's standing in front of a blackboard with some complicated mathematical equation that I could never understand. And I never met him. So he died in 1969, I was born in 1965, and he was in Germany. But I just remember always looking up at him, and he had kind of those typical 1950s glasses, and he looked not really stern, but kind of had like this dreaming look in his eyes. And I would always ask my mom, you know, what about my grandfather? And she would always say, well, he was a genius. And then she would just leave it at that. She didn't really talk about him anymore. And
Did she come to Huntsville at all? Or?
She was in Huntsville. She was in Huntsville for a year. Her senior year, she went to Huntsville High School.
Oh, really?
So
what year would that been?
That was 1955. 1955.
She came in 54.
Yeah.
54. So 54, 55.
All right.
So
54 is the year I reached Huntsville.
Oh, really?
Oh, really?
Okay, so you came in 54. So they were here. My grandfather was here when you came.
Yeah.
But what got me interested all these years later was that I grew up hearing that my grandfather was a genius, which really doesn't mean anything when it's out of context like that, and that he had invented the V1, which I was just a kid. I didn't even know what the V1 was. And I never thought about it my whole life until maybe the last 3 or 4 years. And then I started looking into his life and what he did and how he was a race flyer, and he was this inventor who, no matter what you put in front of him, he would try to solve the problem. And you know, he was a flyer, and he was a skier. So he was a flyer and a skier. So he decided one day that he was going to weld skis onto the bottom of his airplane, and he became the first person that was ever recorded to land on a glacier and then take off. Because
Really?
people had landed.
On the Aletsch Glacier.
On the Jungfrau.
Jungfrau.
Oh,
You
really?
know,
My word. That's a challenge.
That's a challenge.
Jungfrau, yeah.
But he just seemed to, I mean,
I don't know.
I want to know more about him because I never got to know him, and he
I
was
can't find the
truly,
picture.
I think, a pretty remarkable guy.
And as far as I know, there aren't any good books on him yet.
There aren't any good books. There's a documentary that was done in Germany that is fairly comprehensive. There's a lot of articles that we have.
See, when he was doing the flying,
Yes.
the air races, my mother and grandmother cut out all the newspaper articles.
Oh, really?
And made this kind of a scrapbook, and somehow it reached me, but all of that material has been given to the Deutsche Museum in Munich, you know, the
Yes.
All the
famous,
original.
Yeah.
all the originals, and so I only have copies, but they had all of these, you know, pictures of his life, and this is a picture of him landing on the glacier.
Oh, yes.
See, this is the glacier, and with his airplane, and so on. And so I got all these pictures, and they admired those flyers. You know, they gave them flowers and feeded them, you know, and had them in the newspapers, because it was remarkable that they even could fly over the Alps, you know, with the updraft, and during all of these races, one or two always died. You know, it was a new field, you know, actually, this flying.
Do you know if he knew Kuttner?
No, the name is not, was he a flyer?
He's a flyer. He came here to Huntsville too. It was a prize winner for gliders.
Yeah, glider flight, yeah. Well, we lived in in 1946, we moved to a little village near Stuttgart, which was called Nabern, and they had a mountain, and they were launching gliders for Wolf Hirt. Wolf Hirt was a aircraft designer, but in glider. And we lived in an airplane hangar, and what he did there was he designed furniture, which was after the war.
Oh, okay.
But the interesting part is that he designed furniture out of street rubble.
Really?
No, a building in Wiesbaden. He designed furniture out of the leftovers from the glider planes.
From the glider
He would
planes.
design a chair that made into a bed, a couch that made into a container, a cupboard where a piece would come down and become a table. You know, so he was always designing something. And then we went to Wiesbaden, which was the headquarters of the 7th Army, you know,
one of the armies anyway.
armies, and we lived in Wiesbaden, and there he designed a method to build new walls out of rubble. It was called Bauschuttverfahren, means building, rubble building, and he designed that, and that's where the Americans came and asked him whether he wants to come to America. And to me, it was, you know, a dream come true, because we thought that America was paved with gold. That was just a rumor.
Apparently, it was better than where you were, though, at the time.
Right.
Do you happen to know whether, speaking of skiing, you knew Helmut Schmidt?
Yes, Helmut Schmidt, but he was wasn't he the
But he was as I understand it, a prize-winning Olympic skier.
Here. No.
He was one of the group that came to the U.S. He was never in Huntsville, but I knew him well in other contexts.
So after my grandfather went back to work for Messerschmitt after he was in Huntsville, he got embroiled in the Lockheed Starfighter mess.
Oh.
Because he had applied his Lusser's law and theory of reliability to the Starfighter and said, you're trying to make it do too much. You're trying to put too many electronics. It's not going to fly. And then subsequently hundreds of pilots died. So he predicted that mess, and then he ended up leaving Messerschmitt. He was an avid skier, and he broke his Achilles tendon.
Oh my.
as he was trying on his skis in his hotel room, and he got so mad that a binding could actually hurt you when you weren't even skiing, that he designed the first safety ski binding.
Really?
And
that's remarkable.
Remarkable, and that became, he marketed that under the Lusser ski bindings, which was the binding that I learned to ski on when I was 4 years old. We had them. But then Marker and I think another Tyrolia maybe?
Tyrolia and Gertz and
came to try to, they wanted to buy this binding, and they wanted to take the Lusser name off of it and make it a Marker. And he said no.
And
so we could have been rich.
we could have been rich, but shoot.
Well, let's go back to your family a little bit. What did your father do? And
Well,
how did you come about?
Completely unrelated, but in a weird way related. When my mother and my aunts and my family were brought to the United States, they were brought first to Moffett Field in Mountain View, where NASA was, well, it wasn't NASA at the time, but they were doing a lot of work in those big famous hangars. My mother ended up meeting my father at San Jose State University, and they bought a house up on the hill that looks straight down into those hangars, into Moffett Field. I mean, you can, it's the view from their houses of Moffett Field. And then my father ended up getting a job for Lockheed at Moffett Field. So my father would always go to all the space launches at Cape Canaveral. And I still actually don't know why to this day. Unfortunately, he passed away many years ago, but I still don't know what his job was.
He was personnel chief.
He did personnel, but I don't really know why he was flying to Cape Canaveral and what the space connection was there for a personnel guy.
Yeah, to watch the launches.
To watch the launches. So on that side, I had a connection to space. On my mother's side, I had a connection to space, but the two never intersected. They were completely...
They just met each other at college.
Yeah, it was completely coincidental.
And so my sister, her mother, became a writer and teller about Gabi.
My mother was a writer and she did lectures all over the country. She was an English professor from San Jose State, and she also looked into her father's, got very interested in her father's background late in her life to kind of tell this story because it hasn't been told. And you know, this is a wonderful opportunity for us to kind of get our memories on the record and our recollections of who he was, not only as a scientist and a flyer, but as a person, as a man.
Now, I'm sorry that I never got to know him well during the time we overlapped. I was working closely with Werner von Braun, but not with your father, or with your father.
He was here, then in 58 he decided to go back, and he went back in January 59 to go back to Messerschmitt.
And he stayed there then?
And then he stayed there, and Messerschmitt designed, for a while they were not allowed to design anything having to do with the military. But by the time he went back, they were, and Messerschmitt then they developed the first vertical takeoff.
Really?
And he worked on that, and but that thing went to the flying stage and the testing stage, and then it crashed, and then the German government nixed the program.
Really?
Too expensive. This was a
typical government.
Yeah.
Typical government.
Yeah, and that really, truly practically broke Messerschmitt's heart, because from then on he didn't develop anything else anymore.
And when did he die?
Messerschmitt.
Messerschmitt or Lusser?
Lusser died in '69 of
staph infection.
Staph infection. But I don't know when Messerschmitt died.
No, I'm sorry, I was interested in your father.
He died in '69 of a staph infection that he got in the hospital. So he died at the age of 69, which was way too early.
I think one of the things that we couldn't possibly do this oral history without mentioning, and you probably know maybe even more than we do about this, but Robert Lusser and Werner von Braun had an interesting, very complex relationship.
Yes.
Robert Lusser was his soliere, his counterpoint. Robert Lusser was the one who was in charge of making sure that whatever von Braun's team built was reliable. And Lusser did not believe that we could ever send make manned spaceflight a reality without heavy casualties. And so his theory of reliability and everything kind of it flew in the face of Werner von Braun's dream. However, I think the two, from what I've heard and what I've read, had kind of a grudging respect for one another, because Robert Lusser's naysaying made von Braun work even harder and maybe look, I wasn't there, but maybe look one step further at safety and reliability. And when my grandfather died, von Braun sent a telegram to my grandmother that said we wouldn't have made it to the moon without him.
Without the reliability
Without the reliability formula.
Yeah.
So even though it was sometimes a very controversial relationship, and my grandfather was not known to have a lot of tact, and so he would tell anybody that asked him, it's manned space flight, it can't be done, it's not reliable, they're
going to die.
They're going to die.
And then when the Columbia, the
Challenger first,
and then there was a reporter named
Reed Collins, and he wrote an article, and he says, I'm reminded of a fateful meeting with Robert Lusser, the father of reliability, who was tasked with making the moon flight come to pass. And where was Lusser, they call it, Lusser's law, when the Challenger crashed, because it was an O-ring, and later on it was a piece of foam. I mean, such a small thing, But the relationship between my father and von Braun dates way back, because the V1 was developed in Peenemünde West, and the V2 was developed in Peenemünde East, and there was a fence in between. And my dad tells that his engineers were looking this way and their engineers were looking that way, and they had competition going.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
That competition is well documented.
Yeah, and it was 3 months apart that they were launched.
Yeah.
So the V1 was in June, and I believe the V2 was in
Yeah.
September. So, I mean, it was all happening right at the same time, and I'm sure the goal of getting to that finish line was hotly contested by both of them.
Have you read General Dornberger's account of that competition?
No, but I would love to.
We have it down here.
Oh my gosh!
I would
I'd
love to
love
read
to.
that. See,
Yeah.
I knew we would get some good information
But
from you.
the competition, I mean, they had maybe a few months before they put the V1 into action. There was also in Germany, there was a fight between the Air Force and it's always a fight, always a competitive tension. And so they decided to have a Wettrennen, a demonstration of the superiority of one or the other. And so I have a picture in here where all these big guys come and they went into one of those bunkers that we just saw today, where they were, and they shot 6 V1s and they all fell in the ocean. They all tumbled. And then the next day they shot the V2 and it went straight up beautifully. And so my dad said, oh no, I mean, we've had it. And then, but because of internal political, infighting, they decided to build them both.
Yeah, and that's well documented in Dornberger's book.
Oh, really, is it?
Yeah.
That I don't have that book amazes me, because I have a whole library. I'd like to see that.
We'll see it tomorrow.
Okay, good. Yeah.
I laid it out so I can
wonderful.
show it to you.
Fantastic.
I bet you that's really fascinating.
Oh, it is. That's a fascinating book to read. You know, you probably ought to get a copy and read it.
Yeah,
Wouldn't it
it's
be
probably-
fascinating to be the fly on the wall if you could sit Robert Lusser and Werner von Braun down in a room together and be the fly on
Oh,
that
it would
wall?
be, it would be.
That would be
Yeah.
something.
Now, speaking of differences in style, I don't know about Robert's style, but Werner von Braun always did a lot of listening. He would let everybody around the table give their opinion and try to understand what the differences were and so forth.
But Robert Lusser would say, no, you're wrong.
Yeah, well,
And he would.
He was not so diplomatic.
He would say it right, you know, I mean, he was not.
It got him in trouble continuously over his career. His inability to not say what he thought in that moment. And sometimes I think to listen to other people. I think we both share that characteristic.
That's why I didn't want to work in Washington. Because, okay, in the documentary that they did about my father in Germany, the interviewer asked me what was his main aim in life, and I went, well, not the care of his kids, his work. He always focused 100% on his work, regardless of anything that surrounded it. You know, he was obsessively focused on his work, and you actually can't always do that. You know, you have to
balance.
Yeah.
now let me just mention a policy, I guess you'd call it, of von Braun that contributed a lot to the reliability. The general feeling was, or more than the general feeling, the direction was, that wherever you were in the organization, if you had a worry about the reliability or the safety of a component or a system or whatever, it was your role to bring that up. And, you know, if you were a machinist and you thought the piece of stuff you were machining wasn't designed right, you were supposed to bring that up. And 90% of the time, they turned out not to be real problems, or they were easily solved. But nevertheless, you were thanked for having brought them up and sorting them all out. And that's how they caught. That's how they caught all the little problems. Everybody in the organization felt compelled, if they had any worries about the reliability, to talk about it, and they'd be thanked, and that was
now
a very, very important factor.
Now I heard that von Braun always gave credit to his engineers, and so did my dad. I have transcripts of lectures that he gave, and he would say, "It was my team. It is, He didn't say I did it, because it was a team effort."
Von Braun was very much the same, and
Yeah.
emphasized the team. Would not let a biography of him be done during his lifetime. Instead, the book that Ordway and others participated in was the Rocket Team, not a biography of von Braun, for that same reason.
Yeah. So, well, I tell you, I'm eternally grateful that I came to the United States. That is my overriding feeling that I was expressed in my life. That whatever happened in Germany as a child, I was way too young to have any say-so, but whatever happened, it brought me to the United States and makes me really happy to be an American. So.
Anything else that you folks would like to bring up that I may not have asked about?
No, I just, from a personal perspective, World War II was long before my time, but looking back at it and asking the questions. Some of them are very hard questions when you have a history like mine, and von Braun and Lusser and all the rest of them. The Nazi connection and the concentration camp labor, and knowing that those weapons killed people.
Right.
That's one whole part of it over here, where you say, my God, that's heavy, heavy stuff. And then I finally had to get to a place where I tried to put myself in that position and say, what would I have done? I have 5 children. I'm the sole support for those 5 children, and this is my expertise, building things that fly. And now they're telling me to build a weapon of mass destruction. What do you do? And what I realized is that none of us can answer that question because we weren't there. And I think that, sure, there are more egregious people and less egregious people. All of them probably have some culpability, but none of us can say that in that same situation what we would have done.
Yeah.
It's impossible.
I've talked to people who were involved in the atom bomb project, and they really have that.
They carry that burden.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm twice removed from it, but I still feel like, who was my grandfather? Was he this genius German engineer? Was he this horrible Nazi? What we know about my grandfather is that he was a member of the party, but he was not a political nor ideological Nazi. In fact, he thought Hitler was a buffoon, and there are some documented incidents where he actually took steps to help Jews that were persecuted, especially those who worked for him, and he went out on a limb to keep them from getting arrested. But it's somewhere on that line, and you have to come to peace with it.
It was difficult. Now, I was never interested in I came here as a teenager, then I went to college, then I got married, then I had kids, then I was widowed, I was busy, but it wasn't until the late 80s that I even began to look into these things with more my mind open. And then in about 2002, I was invited to an open house at my grandson's grammar school, and I walk in, and there were on the wall were all these books. They were simulated books, and here was a picture of my father, and I said, "What is this?" And the assignment was to write a book as if you were the publisher, and put it together, and I walked up to it, and it said the book was my life as a pilot and a publisher, and the picture, and then it said, my great-grandfather was a very famous man. He built a bomb for Hitler. And
oops,
I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to say, that's my grandson, so I just kind of walked by. Because and that was really the first time when it hit me that you have to somehow make your peace with that. Oh, and then another thing that happened was I came to Cape Canaveral, and there was a V1 and a V2, in the museum. And there was a couple standing next to the V1, and I wanted my military friend to take a picture of me next to the V1. And we waited and waited and waited, and they wouldn't leave. And so I said, I'll just ask them to step aside, and you snap a picture, and we'll go home. And so I walk up to them, and I said, excuse me, my father was the inventor of this machine, and I want my picture taken. And she said, oh my goodness, my grandmother told me all about this, how this, we heard this about, and we talked about it, and then what it sounded like, and what her grandmother had told her about it, and then we all had our picture taken. And to me that was so, it's so crazy how the people themselves, are friends with one another, and yet the history was so terrible, because it was terrible. 7,000 Britishers lost their lives.
Well, those little stories are the silver lining of something that is so horrible that my generation, we can't really understand it because we haven't been through something like that. But the stories that I hear, for instance, of Heide had to go into the Hitler Youth. I mean, this was a requirement.
Oh, yeah.
So she was in the Hitler Youth. If you were 10 by Hitler's birthday, you had to join and you had to go.
And it gets me that the people say, "Ah, you were in the Hitler Youth." And I said, "Listen, you guys, it wasn't like the Girl Scouts. You didn't have a choice. When you were 10 on April 20th, that's when you went in, and it wasn't." And they were so clever to catch all the youth. You know, we were marching, we were collecting plants for the soldiers, and we were picking bugs off the potatoes, and we had sports, and we had singing. You know, they made it really pleasant that you could go, and we also had silent marches where you had to, I don't know, maybe contemplate whatever. And I was 10 and I was always talking, and so I was constantly in trouble, and so they called my mother in and they said, "You know, Heidi would make a wonderful leader if her main vocabulary wouldn't be if and but. But if. So I never made it very far in that organization.
But the real beauty of that story is that in the Hitler Youth, she had a teacher who was anti-Hitler and went out on a limb at her own risk to buck some of the doctrine that she was supposed to be teaching and actually teach the opposite to this
She
group.
took us to church. She every Sunday we were all.
She didn't make him do the high.
Because I was 12 and I fainted, you know, standing up, and blood pooled, and so I fainted. We were in these camps to be safe from bombs, and she was in charge of 36 11-year-olds, and so after two of us fainted, she said, "No more," and so she just abolished all of those rules and took us to church and taught us about religion and
love and peace and acceptance and
yeah. Whereas my sister, who was 2 years older, in her camp it was pushed much harder. Yeah. So anyway, it was it was.
Well, we've been going on for about an hour. I'm sure there are lots of things we haven't covered.
Yeah.
Can never completely
okay,
cover.
so then that documentary that they did in 2008 about Robert Lusser. So then Ludwig Bölkow was an aeronautical engineer, and he in Germany gives a journalistic prize for radio, space, and TV. And the people who did the documentary on my dad won the first prize for TV because she did that documentary. And the guy in it, this is a booklet that's handed to them during the when they pass out the report. And the guy said, the third item goes to Burkhardt and Reinfelder for their documentary on Robert Lusser, who a genius who seems to have his priorities in the wrong place. And see, he said it shows that Lusser set his priorities wrongly, and that technology and innovation should serve mankind and not the other way around. We were invited to come to this presentation, but we couldn't go. It's in Germany, and so I wrote him a letter. I said, you know, I know it is hard. It is easy to judge 40 years after the fact. But I'm asking you, what should he have done? Should he have become a plumber, you know, or you know? So, you know, and I never got an answer. they didn't reply to my inquiry.
I could insert a little comment here, I guess. I've had a fair number of contacts with space historians and so forth from Germany. And one of the things they tell me is that the whole von Braun team is admired more here in the U.S. than it was in
Absolutely.
Germany.
Oh, absolutely.
She has
my
the same feeling.
my brother who lives over there, he said no, because they accused him of that slave labor, and so the big question was, what did he have to do with that? And I do know that von Braun, because he said so in his biography, in his autobiography, that he went there and that he did say, hey, you guys, can't you improve this a little bit? And the chief said, you do your job and I'll do mine, but I think the difference also between Lusser and von Braun is von Braun wanted to realize his childhood dream, okay? And it was going into space, and that was the overriding ambition or desire that he had. And if he needed to take, he couldn't do it privately. It takes the power of the government behind it, and so no matter what it takes. So he joined the party, what do I know, in 1934 or so. My dad didn't join until 39 when he had to, because he wanted to lecture at the technical college in Stuttgart, and they found out that he he hadn't joined the party, so he joined it. And but von Braun, his overriding thing was to realize that dream to go into space. My dad designed a weapon of mass destruction. You can't get around that. You cannot, even though it, in the end, countries like America made use of his systems to build the next weapons.
Yeah, we haven't touched on that, but the V1 was the
first cruise missile.
The first of the cruise missiles, and now cruise missiles are a big thing, and the U.S. Navy has cruise missiles all over the place.
So these people, this guy who said that he applied his ethics, he said his ethics were misapplied. So this guy, I should ask him, dear Herr so-and-so, Dr. so-and-so, where did Robert Lusser go so wrong compared to Bell Laboratories or Lockheed or
Sure.
Raytheon?
The people that built the atom bomb.
Okay,
Right.
yeah, but they took, they had big inner conflicts.
Oh, yeah.
They
Oh,
had
I'm
big,
sure.
big inner conflicts.
I've talked to them.
Did Robert Lusser ever say anything to you or anyone about being conflicted about the V1?
No, he said it was my job to put the thing together, and I bet you he worked like crazy trying to do it. We didn't, but he was always going to write his autobiography later, when I'm chair-bound, when I no longer can do things. I'm going to sit down and write this, and you should never put it off that far, because then
Things happen.
then he died too soon. Yeah.
Well, maybe that's a good note to end the interview on.
Okay.
Surely thank both of you, and I hope we've covered the things you'd like to have covered.
Yeah, for sure. It was great. Interesting.
Cut us off.